The moment my parents stood up at their 30th wedding anniversary celebration at the elegant country club in Bend and publicly announced to everyone that I was engaged to Connor Whitaker without ever consulting me, my entire world tilted on its axis. My name is Isabella Reed. I am 33 years old. The betrayal struck like a cold slap as my mother beamed with false pride, and my father raised his champagne glass while I sat frozen in my seat, realizing they saw me only as a pawn to merge their struggling outdoor retail chain with his family's business empire. Their cheers ignored my real life and choices. That moment sparked something irreversible inside me. Before I dive deeper into how my parents turned what should have been a joyful night into the beginning of the end for our family, if this kind of emotional pressure and public humiliation from the people who raised you hits close to home, please hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world knowing I'm not alone in this. For the past 21 months, I had been keeping a secret from the man I loved and from my own family. It was not a small secret, like forgetting an anniversary, or a medium one, like hiding a minor debt. My secret was that I made $58,000 a month before taxes as a senior software architect at one of the largest tech firms in the Pacific Northwest. I had been writing code since I was 17, sold my first app at 25, and steadily climbed with 3 patents and stock options that could change lives. Yet my fiance Lucas Bennett thought I held a basic support role barely covering rent in a small apartment. I never lied outright. When we met at a local hiking trail, he assumed the details, and I simply never corrected him. Why would I? My grandmother Evelyn had raised me after some hard early years and taught me through her modest life that true character only shows when people think you have nothing to offer them. She passed when I was 26 and left me everything along with a letter I still keep in my nightstand. She wrote that a person's real self emerges when they believe you are beneath their notice and have nothing to give. So when my parents invited us to this 30th anniversary gala and hinted they had big news about my future, I made a decision. I would give them the test my grandmother taught me. I showed up in modest clothes, driving my 15-year-old Honda, and speaking humbly about my circumstances. I would watch how my mother and my father treated the daughter they thought could not help their legacy. I needed to know because I was not just dating Lucas. I was considering building a life with him, and my parents would be part of that forever. The country club ballroom was packed with 150 guests, including neighbors, business associates, and my cousin Megan Foster, who had always felt more like a sister than a distant relative. My mother, Catherine Reed, in her mid-60s, stood like royalty in her tailored outfit, with her blonde hair styled to perfection. My father, Edward Reed, sat nearby, looking weary from years of expanding their outdoor retail chain across 4 states. When my mother introduced Connor Whitaker, the son of a competing family business, as the guest of honor, and loudly declared him a much more suitable partner for someone in our position, I felt the first sharp sting. She said it right in front of Lucas and the whole room that Connor understood the importance of strong family alliances, while some choices were simply not suitable for the long term. My cousin Megan shifted uncomfortably beside me and squeezed my hand under the table, giving me a quick, sympathetic look, but stayed quiet at first. Lucas held my other hand but said nothing. That silence from the man I loved and from my own father hurt almost as much as my mother's words. The evening continued with my mother and my father taking turns making pointed remarks. My mother said she supposed I was not accustomed to formal events given my more modest background. My father nodded along without a single word of defense. They brought up Sophia Langford, an old acquaintance whose family had powerful distribution networks, as the kind of connection that could save their stores from the current rough patch. The implication hung heavy. Lucas was not good enough, and I was not contributing enough to the family name. Later, when I excused myself to get some fresh air, I heard voices from a side terrace. My mother was speaking urgently to my father and a business associate. They were discussing how Lucas was just a temporary phase, and that they needed to steer me toward Connor to secure a merger before the next fiscal quarter, or the stores would face closure. They talked about me as the perfect bridge to make the connection happen and how I was too trusting to suspect anything. My mother said they would push the understanding tonight and find a way to end things with Lucas later once the deal was locked. I stood in the shadows, my hands shaking, not with hurt, but with pure resolve. They saw me as common and disposable. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When I returned to the table, my cousin Megan pulled me aside near the fountain. She whispered that she had overheard snippets too and could not believe how my mother and my father were treating me after everything I had quietly built on my own. Her support in that moment gave me strength and planted the first seed of an alliance I would need. I smiled through the rest of the gala, and when my mother pressed the idea of a follow-up dinner with Connor's family, I nodded and said yes without hesitation. Lucas looked hopeful, thinking it was a step forward, but I knew the truth. My parents were not just holding outdated views, they were actively planning to control my life for their business survival through guilt and public pressure. That night, after Lucas dropped me off at my apartment, I sat alone and started digging. The retail chain was indeed in serious trouble with heavy debt from overexpansion and a franchise agreement up for renewal that looked shaky. I reached out to my colleague Ryan Sullivan at the tech firm, who had a sharp eye for financial patterns, and he agreed to help me verify the details discreetly over the next few days. Ryan was stunned when I explained the situation and promised to pull some public records without raising flags. With Megan texting encouragement and Ryan sending initial findings, I knew I had quiet allies. But playing the role of the grateful daughter while my parents continued their emotional coercion was about to get much harder. They thought they could dictate my future without consequences, and I was ready to show them exactly how wrong they were. The next few weeks tested every ounce of patience I had left. My mother wasted no time turning up the pressure, calling me almost every morning with that sweet but insistent tone she reserved for when she wanted something. She reminded me how the family outdoor retail chain had expanded too quickly and now faced mounting debts that could wipe out decades of work if we did not secure the right alliance soon. My father stayed mostly quiet on the phone but backed her up in person, nodding along as if their plan was the only reasonable path forward. They scheduled a private dinner with Connor Whitaker's family the following weekend and made it clear I was expected to attend alone without Lucas. When I pushed back gently and said I wanted my fiancé there, my mother's eyes narrowed and she said sharply that some relationships were fine for now, but not built for the kind of future our family needed. The words landed like a quiet threat, and I felt the emotional weight of their expectations pressing down harder than ever. My cousin Megan sensed the growing tension and started checking in daily through text messages, offering to come over with takeout so we could talk. She had always been the one person who saw through the polished family image, and she became my quiet anchor during those long evenings. One night, while we sat in my modest living room, she listened as I explained what I had overheard at the anniversary gala and how my parents viewed me as nothing more than a bargaining chip. Megan's face tightened with anger, but she stayed practical, suggesting I document everything in case things escalated. Her support gave me the breathing room I needed to keep playing the compliant daughter while my colleague Ryan Sullivan worked behind the scenes at the office. Ryan, who had become more than just a coworker, after I confided in him, pulled discreet financial summaries showing the chain's franchise agreement was indeed in jeopardy, and the merger talks with Connor's family were the only lifeline left. He warned me that the numbers painted a desperate picture and that my parents were likely willing to sacrifice anything, including my happiness, to keep the business afloat. The dinner with Connor's family arrived faster than I wanted. My mother greeted me at the upscale steakhouse in downtown Bend with a bright smile that did not reach her eyes and immediately steered me toward Connor, introducing him again as the ideal partner who understood family legacy. She said it loud enough for the whole table to hear that Lucas was a nice young man, but lacked the business vision our stores required. My father sat across from me, sipping his wine without a word of correction, his silence feeling like agreement. Connor played along perfectly, leaning in with practiced charm and dropping hints about how our families could combine distribution networks to dominate the regional market. I smiled and nodded while, inside, I felt my resolve hardening like steel. They thought they could guilt me into this arrangement by painting Lucas as temporary and me as ungrateful if I resisted. Little did they know I was already 2 steps ahead. Later that same evening, after the dinner ended, my mother pulled me aside in the parking lot while my father waited in the car. She lowered her voice and said with that familiar mix of concern and control that she had noticed I seemed distracted lately, and that maybe Lucas was holding me back from seeing the bigger picture. She added that true daughters put family first, especially when the stores that paid for my education and childhood were on the line. The guilt trip hit exactly where she intended, and for a split second, I almost wavered until I remembered my grandmother Evelyn's letter. My mother's words were not love, they were leverage. And I filed the moment away as another piece of evidence that their affection had conditions attached. When I got home, I called Ryan and Megan on a three-way line and we reviewed the latest documents he had gathered. The embezzlement angle emerged, then something my mother had quietly authorized to cover personal expenses while claiming it was necessary for business survival. Ryan said the paper trail was solid enough to raise serious questions, and Megan urged me to wait for the right moment to act. The pressure built steadily over the next 10 days. My parents hosted a small gathering at their house to celebrate what they called preliminary merger talks and invited a handful of key suppliers along with Connor's parents. Lucas was conveniently left off the guest list, and when I asked why, my father finally spoke up, saying it was better to keep things professional for now. My mother chimed in right after with a cutting remark that some partners brought value while others simply took up space at the table. The jab stung, but I kept my expression neutral and used the evening to observe how deeply they had already committed to this path. Guests whispered about the potential deal, and I caught Connor watching me with the confident look of someone who believed the arrangement was already sealed. Megan had asked to tag along as moral support, and she stood by my side the entire night, offering subtle encouragement every time my mother steered the conversation back to how perfect Connor and I would look together publicly. By the time the gathering wound down, I had heard enough whispered plans to know the announcement of an official engagement to Connor was being prepared for the following month. My mother cornered me near the dessert table and said with a sharp edge that she expected me to end things with Lucas quietly before the news broke, because embarrassing the family now would destroy everything we had built. Her tone left no room for discussion, and my father stood nearby, nodding once again without intervening. That night, as I drove home with Megan riding shotgun, she turned to me and said softly that this had gone far enough and that I deserved better than being treated like a business asset. Her words echoed my own thoughts, and in that moment, I decided the time for pretending was over. I would let them push the announcement at their next big event, a charity fundraiser they had already planned for 200 guests, and then I would reveal the truth in the most public way possible. Ryan had one final update waiting when I called him the next morning. He had confirmed through contacts that the franchise renewal was hanging by a thread, and that my mother had personally signed off on several questionable transfers to keep the books looking stable. The evidence was damning, and Megan offered to stand with me when the moment came. Everything was lining up, but as I hung up the phone, my heart raced with the realization that once I exposed their schemes, there would be no going back. My parents had forced my hand with their relentless emotional coercion, and now the reckoning they never saw coming was only days away. The charity fundraiser my parents had organized arrived 12 days later, and the grand ballroom at the largest venue in Bend was filled with 220 guests, a carefully chosen mix of suppliers, local business leaders, and influential donors who could make or break their outdoor retail chain. My mother had spent weeks turning the evening into her personal stage, complete with a silent auction and a short program, where she planned to announce the merger as a done deal. She had insisted I attend in the modest navy dress she picked out herself, the one that screamed ordinary daughter who needed saving by a better match. My father greeted guests at the entrance with his usual tired smile, while my cousin Megan stayed close to my side the entire time, her quiet presence a steady reminder that I was not facing this alone. My colleague Ryan had slipped me a final folder of documents just before the doors opened, his face serious as he whispered that everything was verifiable and ready. I nodded heart steady, knowing the moment I had waited for was finally here. The program began smoothly enough with my mother taking the microphone. First, her voice warm and commanding as she thanked everyone for supporting the family business that had served the community for decades. She glanced my way with that practiced smile and said loudly enough for the front rows to hear that tonight marked more than just fundraising, because some family alliances were about to strengthen in ways that would secure our future for generations. My father stood beside her, nodding silently, and then she called Connor Whitaker to the stage, introducing him as the visionary partner who understood what real legacy meant. The jab was unmistakable, aimed straight at me and my fiance, who sat a few tables back, looking confused but supportive. She added with a sharp edge that some choices in life required putting family stability above personal whims, and that true daughters recognized when it was time to step up. The words cut deep, but they also lit the fuse I had been holding for weeks. I felt my cousin Megan squeeze my arm in silent encouragement as Ryan positioned himself near the back with copies of the evidence ready if needed. My mother turned to me, then extending her hand like she was granting me an honor, and said in that cutting tone she reserved for when she thought she had the upper hand that I should come up and say a few words about how excited I was for the future with Connor. The room quieted, all eyes on me, and I rose slowly, walking to the stage with the folder tucked under my arm. My father shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing to stop her. That was the final confirmation I needed. My mother had initiated every single humiliation, every public slight, every demand that I sacrifice my happiness for their failing empire, and now she was forcing the announcement. Right here in front of everyone who mattered. I took the microphone from her and looked out at the crowd, my voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline. I thanked my mother for the warm introduction and for showing me exactly who she and my father truly were over the past few weeks. I described how they had treated me like a common bargaining chip at their 30th anniversary gala, comparing me unfavorably to old acquaintances with better connections while dismissing my fiancé as temporary. Gasps rippled through the room as I revealed what I had overheard on the terrace, their urgent plans to steer me toward Connor to save the chain from collapse before the next fiscal quarter. My mother's face drained of color, but she tried to interrupt with a nervous laugh, saying I must be mistaken and that this was hardly the place for family jokes. I cut her off sharply, reminding her that the true character of people only shows when they think you have nothing to offer, and that she and my father had failed that test completely. I pulled out the documents then and held them up, explaining in clear terms how the retail chain faced serious structural problems from overexpansion, how the franchise agreement was about to be terminated, and how my mother had personally authorized questionable transfers amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep appearances alive while pretending everything was fine. My colleague Ryan stepped forward from the crowd, at that point confirming the paper trail was solid and that he had already shared copies with key suppliers in the room who had their own stakes in the business. My cousin Megan stood too, her voice ringing out as she said she had witnessed enough of the emotional pressure to know this was not love but control. The room erupted in murmurs while my father slumped in his chair, his silence finally breaking as he muttered that this was not how things were supposed to go. Connor looked stunned, backing away from the stage as his parents whispered urgently to each other. My mother recovered enough to snatch at the microphone, her voice rising in desperation as she insisted this was all a misunderstanding and that I was clearly overwhelmed by stress. But the damage was done. Several guests were already checking their phones, and one major supplier pulled my father aside right there, his expression grim. I set the microphone down and stepped off the stage, walking straight to my fiancé, who met me halfway with a look of quiet understanding. I had won the truth, but the cost settled in immediately as my mother turned away from me in the crowd, refusing even to meet my eyes, while my father stared at the floor, like a man who had lost everything in one evening. The irreversible loss hit me. Then, not just the business fallout, but the permanent fracture in the family bond I had once believed was unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, the chain did not collapse overnight, but the franchise renewal was denied, and several key suppliers pulled out, forcing my parents to downsize dramatically and sell off stores to stay afloat. Investigations into the questionable transfers began quietly, though nothing ever reached criminal charges. My mother never called again, and my father sent one brief message, saying he wished things had been different before going silent forever. The emotional coercion that had defined our relationship ended the day I chose myself, but so did any chance of reconciliation. My fiancé and I grew closer through it all. His support steady where my parents had been conditional, yet the ache of losing that family connection lingered like a quiet scar. My cousin Megan and my colleague Ryan became the chosen family. I never knew I needed their loyalty, a reminder that real character shows up when it matters most. I still live in my modest apartment, still drive the same 15-year-old Honda, and still make the same $58,000 a month doing work I love on my own terms. The lesson my grandmother Evelyn taught me proved truer than I ever imagined. A person's worth is never measured by what they can give others, but by the integrity they hold when no one is watching. My parents had thought they could control me through guilt and public pressure, but all they accomplished was showing me I was stronger without them. Choosing myself came at a high price, the irreversible loss of the family I grew up believing in, yet it also brought a peace I would never trade back. Thank you for listening to my story. If my experience with emotional coercion from the people who raised me resonates with you, drop a comment below about a time when setting boundaries cost you something precious but gave you freedom. I read every one, and knowing we are not alone in these hard choices makes the journey feel a little lighter.